Hi folks, I am Harri Savolainen. I am an RPG publisher and game master. And welcome to my channel. Today I'm talking about my Call of Cthulhu scenario Whispers in the Frostbound Woods. I will cover some of the ideas behind it and share a few tips for keepers who want to run it. But before we go there, one quick warning. This video includes spoilers, so if you are planning to play the scenario as an investigator, now it's probably a good time to stop watching. For everyone else, let's watch the small trailer to get us immersed into the story. Let's get into the scenario itself, the feeling it aims for, and how I pictured it being played. And I also share some of the ideas and thoughts that came up while writing it. But just to warn, this scenario can be pretty demanding, both for the players, but especially for the keeper. The main idea was to build a story around conflict between characters, growing unease and pressure from duty, and that classic Lovecraftian madness that's slowly building inside the group. A lot of Lovecraft stories, especially the case of Charles Dexter Ward, one of the inspirations for the scenario, deals with the madness that kind of slowly erodes someone's personality. And I wanted to capture that feeling and turn that into something that players could experience together at the table. And this scenario is mainly about the interaction between the player characters and NPCs, their thoughts, their motives, and their internal conflict between their worldviews. Just to admit, the actual plot is intentionally left fairly simple. The book is built in a dual structure, meaning it can be played like two different ways, almost like separate adventures. A bit similar as to another well-known scenario, Blackwater Creek from Chaos Zoom. My scenario takes place in 1940s Finland during difficult times, and the players can play either Finnish Civil Guard patrol or a group of Soviet spies called Desants. No matter which side players decide to choose, the structure is basically a journey through the wilderness, a bit like another well-known scenario, administration trees. But there the similarities end. The journey is built around important key events, and some of those events are different depending which storyline is being played. The design storyline is more open-ended, whereas where their focus is in survival and completing their mission, and they are also the first to discover the dark history of the past and of the region. Whereas the Civil Guard storyline's more about following the trail, trying to piece together what has happened, and slowly uncovering the same horrors. Most of the real story, as a matter of fact, happens between those three provided key events. And that's through conversations, from arguments and tension, and that sort of a classic role playing between characters. And this is something what is the key purpose of this scene, to slowly reveal the ancient horror and keep increasing the pressure inside the group. And most importantly, the wilderness and the horror are not the true enemy. The real enemy is the historical setting and the people themselves. And next, I'll provide you some insight on historical background of the scenario. The scenario takes place during interim peace, and that's between Winter War and Continuation War. Finland had just recently gained its independence only a year earlier in 1917, and soon after the country was torn apart by brutal civil war in 1918. The Reds, representing the working class, fought against the whites who represented the middle and upper classes. The war itself was short but extremely violent, and it left deep divisions in Finnish society. After the war, communism was banned in Finland, and many of its supporters fled to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union itself had been formed in 1922, first under Lenin and later under Stalin, whose rule became more and more paranoid over time. During 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, a campaign of terror that aimed at people who they saw as threats to the regime. And that was immigrants, academics, former party members, and officers, and many others who were targeted. And then came Winter War in 1939, and it ended in 1940 with Moscow Peace Treaty, where Finland was forced to give up large regions, including Karelia. And that caused huge refugee crisis and left deep scars across the country. And by 1941, tensions were still really high. Soviets sent descents over the border and in espionage and sabotage missions. And from the human point of view, the whole situation was really tragic. On the other side, you have the civil guard, that's suojeluskunta in Finnish, mostly ordinary local people driven by duty, fear, or pressure. On the other side, some of the people who had fled to the Soviet Union hoping for entering the communist utopian society were now being sent back as spies because they knew the language and the culture and area. And they were, if they were captured, which they often were, they were executed on the spot as traitors. And what interested me the most in this situation was that on both sides, all the people were just ordinary people pushed by governments and ideology and turning against each other, and people were forced to constantly to watch a betrayal inside of their own groups. And on top of all this, I wanted to add something else, something really wild, cold wilderness, the isolation, and ancient presence beneath the frozen ground. A kind of Lovecraftian madness that slowly spreads through the group and tears it apart from inside. And that's why internal conflict is really the heart of this scenario. And it also makes it very different from other Call of Cthulhu scenarios. The most important parts are not really the story or plot itself. The best moments of this scenario comes from the role-playing dialogue between the players and NPCs as the tension keeps building. The pre-generated characters were designed specifically for that, and they have all conflicting backgrounds, beliefs, and personalities. There are political tensions, religious tensions, people who believe strongly in science or ideology, hardness shoulders shaped with trauma, pacifists, atheists, and deeply religious characters all mixed together inside the same group in this terrible environment. And all of that conflict is intentional. It reflects exactly how the political atmosphere was actually at a time. In both of the storylines, the group is led by a professional soldier, but the rest of the characters vary a lot in age, personality, and worldview, and all of the pretense are always present in the story. If players don't choose some of them, they stay in the group as NPCs, and that gives the keeper some tools to bring more tension in the scenes more actively. It also means players can take over NPCs if the original characters die during the adventure. And as the story goes forward, the players are forced into the more and more difficult moral choices. And those choices become increasingly affected by the presence beneath the frozen ground. The madness, the entity called Uinuva Ikirouta. When I wrote this scenario, I had two main guiding ideas. The first was that there is no big monster at the end of the story waiting for players to encounter it, but instead the players bring the horror with them, and in the end, they become it. And the second idea was that the scenario should be historically really grounded, and a lot of the details come from historical research, memoirs, and archival material. And I've done a lot of research for to be make it as believable and realistic as possible. In the beginning, I promised to share some experiences and provide some guidance for fellow keepers who are considering running this scenario. So here they are. First of all, I really recommend reading through historical background sections in the book before running the scenario. They give important contexts for both Civil Guard and the Descents. The growing influence of Uinuva Ikirota and the effects of the harsh environment and coldness can be tracked with two optional progress clocks inspired by Blades in the Dark role-playing game. I recommend using them mainly as an atmosphere and pacing tools, not as a strict game mechanics. And there are also a scenarios planning sheet which I included in the book. The purpose of it is to help you to prepare the overall structure and pacing of the story beforehand. I also added some encounter tables that are mostly there for inspiration. I wouldn't recommend relying on them entirely through random rolls. And the book also contains sections marked for reading aloud or paraphrasing. Those are mainly there to support atmosphere and to helping keeper to frame the scenes. Feel free to adapt them however you want to fit your own style as a keeper. Especially for experienced keepers, I wouldn't recommend directly reading them as is. Oh, and one extra thing I wanted to mention is the Devil's Field scene. The inspiration for it came from the time shift scenes of the Horror on the Orient Express, a classic, where players briefly take the roles of the historical characters to see events from the past. And I always found those scenes really memorable. So I wanted to create something similar here, something strange, unsettling, and closely connected to Uinuva Ikirota. There's actually very little traditional gameplay in that scene, but all the same time, a lot of happens emotionally and narratively. In every playtest group so far, the players have tried to save the sacrificed child by attacking the shaman during the ritual. And if the shaman survives, the players can later speak with him and learn something more about what is buried beneath the rock at the end of the scenario. How heavily you run the scene is completely up to keeper. Important thing is the making sure that the players still feel involved and not just like passive observers. I'd recommend thinking ahead which parts of the narrative you want to focus and exactly when the shift back to the present time happens and how much you provide the context and the playability if you like on that particular scene. In general, I should warn that both running and playing this scenario can be mentally exhausting. Managing NPC conflicts, keeping tension high, and allowing divisions to form inside the group requires constant attention from the keeper. And I've also received feedback that there is a quite lot for the keeper to read out loud, which can sometimes make the scenario feel almost like a novel being read to the players. That's definitely not the intention. The read out loud sections should mainly be treated as a guidance for keeper, for atmosphere, for events and historical detail. Keepers should feel the freedom to shorten them, adapt them, or present them in their own way. Some scenes may also feel very light in terms of actual plot progression. And that's intentional too. Their purpose is to create space for discussions, disagreements, and tension inside the group. And that's where the real story happens in this scenario. One of my playtest players actually said afterward that they loved how heavily this scenario focused on role playing and that it become really memorable experience because of it. And as a keeper, your role is to introduce doubt, encourage disagreements, and create situations where tensions naturally rise to the surface. Campfire conversations should absolutely drift into the political arguments, ideological debates, and personal conflicts. And that is the core part of the experience in this particular scenario. The final challenge for the keeper also comes with the ending. Players are expected to eventually turn against each other, and in practice, that can be actually surprisingly difficult. Even when players understand what's happening, there is often hesitation. And one good way to support this is actually by allowing multiple characters, both NPCs and PCs, to fall under the influence of Uinova Ikirota and sort of form coalitions within the NC. The scenario itself is designed as a one-shot, and the cave acts as the final stage of the story. Most endings, therefore, will probably lead to at least partial party kill, especially if the crystal is broken and the entity is released. I'd like to end with a one short story about from a playtest session. In one of my games, the descent group actually managed to escape the cave after suffering heavy losses from this confrontation. They contacted their command by radio and were ordered to return and recover the crystal. One of the remaining NPCs was sent back to the cave, and the entity took hold of him and forced him to break the crystal. And once it was released, wiped out the rest of the group. They were incredibly close making out from the forest alive. I hope you have found this interesting and useful. The scenario we have discussed today, Whispers in the Frostbound Woods, is available on DriveThruRPG. If you want to get notified on my new content or publications, see the description or use the QR code on the screen to follow my Instagram account. With that, thanks for watching, and above all, have a great games. Cheers.